So our first speaker is Professor Ken Hinchcliff, who's a graduate of the Melbourne Veterinary School and is now actually Dean of the Faculty of Veterinary Science at the University of Melbourne. After several years in practice in Victoria, he did an advanced training program in large animal medicine at Wisconsin, where he got board certified in medicine and a PhD at The Ohio State University. Ken was a faculty member in the College of Veterinary Medicine at OSU, up through the ranks to professor before he joined Melbourne in 2007. He's published a lot and he's written a textbook on equine sports medicine. His research is focused on exercise science and in particular the use of furosemide in horses. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you, Wayne, and it's a pleasure to be here. I thank you all very much for the invitation and Her Royal Highness colleagues. I'd like to start this afternoon's session off by speaking fairly briefly, I think, about the association between administration of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs and athletic performance in healthy horses. NSAIDs in athletic horses, as we all know, they're very commonly administered. And in one study, and I'm sorry if I revert to referring to horse racing in a number of instances, but that's where some of the information is, 56% of 14,500 thoroughbred horses racing in the US in the late 1997 and 1998 over a 2-week period were administered phenylbutazone before they raced. The frequency of out-of-competition use for horses training to compete in FEI events is not widely reported, if in fact it's known. And from a comparative point of view, it's interesting to note that at the Sydney Olympics, 25.6% of human athletes declared use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs during the Olympics. So the high frequency of use, the potency of these drugs raises some important questions, many of which have been discussed today and which I certainly will not be going into in any detail. The safety is of course paramount, as is the efficacy. And the drug needs to be safe and it needs to work. When it comes down to the efficacy of the drug, are they efficacious in enhancing recovery, or do they have the potential to delay or decrease the effects of training? Two important things that I think will be dealt with in different sessions today. And then finally, the part of the session that I'm delegated to deal with, which is the effect on performance. Do non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs affect performance? Well, there are some potential mechanisms of effects of NSAIDs on performance in healthy horses. They can enhance performance, and that's probably the one that most of us are concerned about and which we think about first in this concept. But we should also remember that these drugs could have the capacity to impair performance. So during our discussions, we must consider both of these. I think probably the first one, enhancement of the performance, is important from a regulatory point of view. Impaired performance may be important from from a health and safety or welfare point of view. How can they do some of these things? Well, we've had several discussions today, some very excellent ones about that have detailed the pharmacologic effects of the non-steroidals in horses, and principally but not solely, they act by blocking prostaglandin production. And prostaglandins, as you gathered from the talk at which Professor Tutane was the guest presenter, there are many effects of prostaglandins in the body. And if you interfere, administration of a non-steroidal does not selectively block just some of those, it tends to block all of them, depends whether it's a COX-1 or COX-2 selective. So there are effects of prostaglandins on blood vessels and metabolism that may well be expected to have an effect on performance. These are a couple of images, and the one to your left is the head of a horse from the Parthenon. It's one of the Elgin Marbles. And what captured me about this horse, this image of a horse, was the look of absolute exhaustion and on this horse. And really it was part of a frieze where the horses were pulling a chariot. So this image represents what a horse can feel like at the end of maximal exertion. And those of us that have ever been athletes, even amateur or just part-time, know how sometimes uncomfortable extreme exercise can be. And it really raises the point about whether there is the potential for non-steroidals to have a mechanism of action that provides some analgesia during extreme exercise. Certainly we heard this morning that there is a central inhibition of pain that's achieved by the non-steroidals, separate to any decrement or decrease in inflammation, say in a peripheral lesion. So one has to wonder whether this discomfort that's associated with extreme exercise could be, in fact, attenuated by the administration of non-steroidals. There is, I should hasten to add, no evidence to support this role in exercise, either in humans or in horses. So the question is, well, what evidence is there for an effect or an association of non-steroidals and athletic performance in horses? Well, there's a couple of things, some principles that I think we really need to consider before we go into looking at the actual studies that have been reported. One of those is that we need to address the outcome of interest. Now, this becomes somewhat challenging, and as we read a number of the papers, we'll see that what happens in experimental studies is that we often address surrogate outcomes. So we're interested in, does phenylbutazone allow horses to run longer? So we put horses on a treadmill and measure their run time to fatigue. We're not actually measuring the outcome of interest, an endurance horse and the time to fatigue. We're measuring something different in a horse running on a treadmill. We also tend to look at inferred outcomes. So we give a drug to a horse and then we notice that its blood lactate concentration during exercise on a treadmill is higher than when we did not give the drug. And then from that, we infer a potential mechanism on performance, but we don't demonstrate the effect on performance. And then the final one is the actual outcome. And this is what's crucial. If we really want to know the answer to the question, we have to answer the question we want to ask, or that we ask. So the actual outcome is the one we're interested in. In horse racing, it's did they win? Did they finish in the first three? Were they the fastest horse in the race? What was the margin that they won by? In eventing, it's the score or the mark that the horse achieved. It might be the height of the jumps that they were able to achieve. So there's a number of things that are actual measures of performance outcome that are real and meaningful in the context of what the horse is used for. And the final point is that we must ensure that there is adequate statistical power to detect a meaningful difference. I'm going to go through this in another couple of slides. We want to know, is there an effect of a drug? Well, it requires to do so, to determine that, we need some information. We need to know what is the smallest effect we want to detect. Is it 0.5% between the drug effect and no drug effect? Is it 1%? Is it 5%? We have to decide what's the margin that we want to detect. And going into the experiment without that knowledge is going in blind, and you very likely will fail. We also have to be certain, want to be certain that this effect is not by chance. We can't be certain, but we can have some level of assurance. And usually it's 5%. We accept that 5% of the time we're going to be wrong in the effect that we demonstrate. If we find a positive effect 5 times out of 100, that may well not, in fact, be true. We can change that by how we design our experiment, but we have to accept some uncertainty around that. The corollary, or the flip side to that, is what is the probability, at what probability do we want to be able to detect a positive effect? Do we want to be sure that we detect it 80% of the time, if in fact it's true, 90%, 95%? All of those have effects on how you design your experiment and how you interpret the results. And finally, we need some idea of how variable the outcome is. If you take a horse out and run it over a distance 10 times, it's not always going to run at exactly the same speed or finish that distance in exactly the same time. There's background variability. Given that background variability, we have to be able to know that so that we can calculate whether we can in fact detect a difference that's caused by the drugs. This all leads us to the number of animals that are needed to be treated or to be included. Now again, back to a racing analogy, just because it's visually easier. The photo on the left is from the 2008 Melbourne Cup, the richest race in the Southern Hemisphere and one of the richest races in the world. This race in 2008, the horse at the top, Viewed, won by 2 inches over the horse at the bottom, Bauer. The difference in purse was about $1.6 million. That's 2 inches over a 3,200 metre, race. Over a 2-mile race, it was 2 inches. It was, 5 centimetres over a 3,200 metre race. Absolutely minuscule margin. So using that, and as a way of thinking, so what would that margin be? I don't know, about 0.00001%. So this is the percent difference between drug treatment trials and no drugs. So if we wanted to detect a 2% difference, we need to look at about 200 horses in a crossover trial, a 2% difference. A 2% difference in a race such as this would be 4 lengths. If we want to detect a 1% difference, we need 750 horses. If we want to detect a 5% difference, we need 2,700 horses. This is not, there's no magic in these numbers. This is simply applying those criteria. What's the difference we want to detect? What's the smallest difference? How sure do we want to be that we can detect it? And if that's the case, how do we design the experiment to be able to detect it? And this is the acid test. And this explains a number of the studies that I'm now going to go into. So how can we detect effects of non-steroidals on performance? There's a couple of ways of going at this. There's the gold standard study, and the gold standard study is the one that looks at the variable of interest, the outcome of interest, in horses that usually compete under conditions of competing. And the only thing that changes is whether they got the drug or not. So therefore, when you come to answering the question, or providing an answer, you've actually done it under conditions that are realistic and meaningful. So that's what I'd call a gold standard study. In humans, that would be a randomized controlled, placebo-controlled blinded field trial. We'd use the non-steroidal of interest, we'd use the population of interest, and we'd use the outcome of interest, whether it's a dress guard score, cross-country time, number of faults, choose your parameter. But you need to know what it is and you need to know what the margin is. Field studies, such as I just suggested, have a number of advantages. They have the potential to unequivocally answer the precise question being asked, and they provide highly relevant results. So you can quantitate the uncertainty around the results, and the results are given for the test that you've chosen, so the particular outcome. Disadvantages are, as you saw, they need huge numbers of horses sometimes. They're logistically challenging to organise, they're expensive, and they only ever answer, if they're done properly, 1, 2, perhaps 3 questions. They don't answer a multitude of questions. They're not designed to, and if they're set up to answer a whole lot of questions, then you're not going to answer any of them very well. Do one thing and do it well. Now, much more common studies, and ones that I started my career off, and Peter Calling started his career off doing these sorts of things. Treadmill studies. Why do we do treadmill studies? Treadmill studies are great in a lot of ways because they allow you to examine a whole lot of physiological variables during and after exercise. And you have horses such as this one with masks on to catch expired gases, with pumps and tubes and catheters going in every orifice. You can measure a whole heap of things so that you really can get a lot of data. A lot of data doesn't necessarily mean you're answering a question. Treadmill studies have the advantage in that they run under tightly controlled experimental conditions. They measure multiple variables, so they give you a high explanatory power, and they can answer specific physiologic or pharmacological questions. So you can actually often ask some fairly specific questions. Their disadvantages are they're limited by a small number of horses. I think if you're putting 12 horses through one of these studies, you're doing a lot of work. They're intense studies. So as a function of that, as a result of having a low number of horses in the study, you have low statistical power. You don't measure the real outcome of interest. You're only measuring surrogate outcomes or making inferred assessments about outcome. And it requires extrapolation of a physiological variable to an outcome. It puts you several steps away from the real answer. And every time you make an inference or an assumption at each of those steps, you run the risk of being wrong. So, do non-steroidals alter performance? Well, there are no gold standard studies that I was aware of. There's one field study that might have some relevance. There may be others, but this is the only one that I'm aware of. And there are several laboratory studies, and I'm just going to quickly go through these. This was some results that were reported in another study, a study with a slightly different title that we did and reported back in 1999, I think it was. But buried in that study is the fact that we looked at 14,599 thoroughbreds who were eligible to receive phenylbutazone racing over a 2-week period in the United States. And what we did was we looked at estimates of performance in their racing speed, 6 furlong race times, earnings, likelihood of winning, whether they won, those sorts of things. Of the roughly 14,500 horses, 1,700, so about 13%, received phenylbutazone alone, and about 6,400 received a combination of phenylbutazone and furosemide. With some fairly complicated statistical analysis, we were able to say that there was no detectable effect of phenylbutazone on any of the outcomes variables that we were interested in. For instance, the 6 furlong race time, which is probably the most important one or most telling one, there was essentially there was no statistical difference in the race time between these two lots of horses. So this is on almost 15,000 horses. It was a retrospective observational study, very tightly controlled around in terms of its statistical analysis, produced positive results for the furosemide part of it, not for the phenylbutazone. So I think that's fairly, it's not compelling, but it's fairly persuasive evidence that at least in that type of a horse, there is no effect of phenylbutazone on performance. Several treadmill studies, and again characterised by small numbers of horses, exercise tests of marginal relevance to the intended outcome or the intended audience, measured multiple outcome variables and little consistency in results. So putting all these together, it's a little bit hard to make a point. I'm just going to run through them quite quickly here, and most of these are readily available through literature searches. Basically, some of the early ones, Callings and Persson, meclofenamic acid, flunixin, horses running over ground at a speed of about 200 beats per minute, and a speed that it caused a heart rate of about 200 beats per minute. Really no effect. Increased the anaerobic threshold marginally. That's the speed at which blood lactate started to accumulate, but a fairly small effect. One of my earlier studies, 6 horses, phenylbutazone, 4.4 milligrams per kilogram, 60 minutes before we ran them on a treadmill for an hour. The phenylbutazone prevented exercise-induced increases in thromboxane concentration, but there was no effects on, 20 or 25 variables that we measured. I mean, it was another one of those things where the highly instrumented horses, cardiovascular, metabolic parameters didn't find any effects. Mitten in 1996, also out of my lab, we looked at phenylbutazone on heart rate, on cardiovascular variables in horses undergoing an incremental exercise test to fatigue. So this was a high-speed exercise test. Again, large dose of phenylbutazone, abolished the increases in thromboxane and 6-prostaglandin 6,2-alpha, a higher heart rate and right atrial pressure in horses treated with phenylbutazone, and an increased RER with phenylbutazone. So this increased RER goes along with some changes in metabolism which were otherwise undefined. And there was no difference in runtime to fatigue. Merle Manaha from Illinois, similar sort of test, but looking at, again, cardiovascular function, maximal exercise test, there was no effects on heart rate or right atrial function, so exactly the opposite results to the previous study, or on pulmonary vascular pressures. Callings et al. In 1999, trotting 5 horses on a track, 5 standardbreds. They received flunixin. There was some altered gait characteristics, increased stance time, but there was no effect on lactate or heart rate, nor on performance, nor on race time. Colohan et al., treadmill study, 12 horses, were a really large study for a treadmill. Incremental exercise test, the horses ran for about 230 seconds. Again, flunixin meglumine, there was no effect on run time between the 2 treatments, and there was no effect on any of the multiple measures, metabolic measures that were measured, except for the prostanoids when there was a reduction in thromboxane and prostaglandin F2 alpha production. So, in summary, the treadmill studies, they uniformly and not surprisingly demonstrated that non-steroidals decreased prostaglandin production during exercise. There was no important and consistent effects on metabolic variables. There were variable reports of an effect on cardiovascular function, and hard to assess the importance of those changes in cardiovascular function. There was no effect on any performance parameter measured, but we have to note the type 2 error rate here. There's a high likelihood that given the small number of horses that there might have been an effect and it was not detected. The single field study, there was no effect on performance, and we have to be careful because they were thoroughbred race horses, so certainly the model there is not directly relevant to any of the FEI events. So, to finalise, where to from here? If it's the concern of the group that performance-altering effects of non-steroidals are important, then there's some things to think about. How important is it to answer this question? Is this something that's going to fundamentally change the outcome of this Congress and the subsequent decision? I think on the weight of it at the moment, as I'll repeat again, there is not persuasive evidence that non-steroidals in healthy horses alter performance. But how important is it that that question's answered? If it's important that it's answered, we have to determine what are the critical performance measures. So, and particularly there, what's the margin of effect that we need to detect? So what's the smallest margin of, or the largest margin of effect that you need to detect? Is it 0.1%? Would you be happy missing 0.1% and saying, we'll be happy if we can detect it at the 1% level? If there's 1% difference, we need to know. If it's 0.1%, we don't need to know. Or should it be 5%? Where's your cutoff? We have to define the important performance-related measures. So again, that is event-specific. What is the outcome of interest that we need to look at? And that's all part of the study design. Do we need also to look at things like recovery, the duration of the horse's career, and the standard of its career, and whether it received non-steroidals? And we'd need to design and undertake appropriate field studies examining probably no more than 1 to 3 important outcomes in order to appropriately address these questions. Okay, actually we're not doing any questions now, so great.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.